Hey everyone, it's Jason Pannone, Head of Reference and Cultural Assets Manager here at the East Hartford Public Library. For today's episode of Raiders of the Lost Archive, I'm going to talk about the two known graves of African Americans that are in Historic Center Cemetery right next to the library. Just a little bit of background about the cemetery. It was founded in 1709, mostly because before that, if anyone had died and wanted to be buried, they would have had to been taken across the river and buried in Hartford. And given the time and expense involved in doing that, the residents of what's now East Hartford petitioned the General Assembly to have their own burial ground on the east side of the river. Remember, East Hartford did not become its own town until 1783. So before that, they were considered part of Hartford. So any burials and such that took place would have to have gone across the river. Now, it's kind of an interesting story, so I'm going to read a little bit from what the Friends of Center Cemetery have put together. Then I'll talk about the two graves of Pomp Equality and Pitt Judith, and then end with a little bit about slavery in Connecticut. I did a lot of research this week about it and found out quite a bit that I did not know and want to pass on. So, according to the research done by the Friends of Center Cemetery, there are only two marked graves for slaves, and these are in the cemetery's first row. The one being for Pitt Judith, who was born in 1743, died 1810, and Pomp Equality, born 1759 and died in 1824. Now, it's important to know that this was originally the last row of the cemetery, and that's usually in colonial New England. If there were African Americans, slaves buried, it was usually in the back of the cemetery. I know in the historic cemetery of Norwich Town in Norwich, Connecticut, the slaves and the African Americans are buried in the back, in the least desirable part of the cemetery. It's an unfortunate fact of history, but there it is. It was the last row because originally you didn't enter the cemetery from Main Street or from Center Street. You would have entered it from the side where there's now the parking lot for, I believe, Save-A-Lot. It's also possible that the graves were set off by themselves and that around in the later 1800s they were moved closer together just for ease of mowing. Footstones were dug up and placed at the back of the headstones. It may not even be their original burial place. There would have to be more excavation and research done on that. It's interesting to note, though, that even though they were in the back, they were still buried among their white contemporaries, which indicates that they were well regarded in the community despite their race. It's very interesting. We don't really know much about Pitt Judith. We don't even know if Pitt was male or female. We don't know if the name was actually Judith Pitt. Regardless, this person would have died as a slave because they were born before 1784. Connecticut in 1784 enacted a law that all slaves born in the state after March 1st, 1784 would be freed at age 25. In 1792, another law was passed that all slaves 25 to 44 were freed, and there were penalty imposed on those masters who refused to do that. In 1797, the age of manumission of freeing was reduced to 21. But Connecticut was the last state in New England to abolish slavery, and not until 1848. That's just 12 years before the Civil War. And Connecticut has had a very contentious history with slavery. My research indicates that of all the New England states, Connecticut had the most slaves, not because it was directly involved in the slave trade. That was more Rhode Island and in Newport. But a lot of the farming economy, especially in southeastern Connecticut and New London County, depended on slavery, and that's where the highest concentration of slaves was, working in farming, livestock raising. And Connecticut, while there were individual merchants who participated in the so-called triangle trade of rum, molasses, and slaves, what Connecticut provided was a lot of the provisions for the slave owners in the West Indies. So a lot of the beef and provisions would have come from Connecticut. And slavery in Connecticut was no picnic. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And getting back to Pitt Judith, so even though this person would have been born before 1784 and too old to be freed, this law was to ensure that non-productive slaves, the elderly, children who were not able to work, would not be set free with little else to become public charges. Basically, nobody wanted to have to support them after they had been freed. So and other than that, we don't know anything about Pitt Judith. We don't know who this person was, he or she, which family did they belong to? I hate to say that language, but that's legally how it was at the time. Pomp equality, though, is a different story. He was a slave of Daniel Pitkin, and this Pitkin, of the famous Pitkin family that I've talked about before, they owned and ran a tavern on the ferry landing on the east side of the Connecticut River that went across to Hartford. He would have been freed at the age of 32 in 1792. Pomp is probably short for Pompey, the famous Roman general. It was common to give male slaves names and female slaves Roman names. He possibly took the last name of equality as his surname upon gaining his freedom. He became quite wealthy. He owned a house on an island in the Connecticut River, which has since eroded away. He owned his own schooner and was a successful ship captain. And that's important to note because schooners cost a lot of money, and to have financial backers not only willing to lend him the money, put the money up front for him to purchase a schooner, but to be willing to trade with him and do other things. That says quite a bit about his character and his industry and all that. His house was on the Connecticut River, just about opposite where the colt factory would eventually be built. It explains why, also, because he was wealthy, they could afford a headstone. Most people did not have headstones. They would have had simple wooden markers, and once they rotted away, that was it. But that's about all we know of pomp equality. It's interesting to note, though, that both Pomp and Pitt Judith had headstones. Someone must have really cared for Pitt Judith. He or she must have been an important part of someone's family for them to have provided what was a rather large headstone and to have them buried among their white neighbors. And it's sad that the story is lost to history. If anybody has any oral history, I would love to hear it. I would love to know more about it because it really does tell the story of East Hartford and slavery in Connecticut. And it's important that these details and these stories don't get lost, and that I don't tell them, but people involved and related tell them in their own words. And speaking of people in their own words, when I was doing reading, I found this about this book. It's about Venture Smith. Venture Smith was born in Africa, captured as a young man during a raid on his village in what's now around Lake Chad in West Africa, taken to the coast and enslaved. And he was brought to Connecticut, sold 3 times before he eventually worked his way and was able to buy not only his own freedom, but his wife, daughter, and 2 sons. He worked very, very hard, was very highly respected, kind of like pomp equality. Eventually he moved around quite a bit. He was in North Stonington for a while, and eventually his last years of his life were spent in East Haddam. And like pomp equality, he's buried in the cemetery of the Congregational Churchyard in East Haddam with his white neighbors, with a very large, prominent tombstone and family plot. And I would like to go visit it soon. It's actually not that far from me. Slavery in Connecticut was unfortunately complicated. There was a lot of abolitionist sentiment early on, especially with the Quakers, but slavery lasted a long time in Connecticut, and there are still slaves being listed in the 1820, 1830 census. People who were old enough, who did not make the cutoff to be freed, and it was not formally abolished until 1848. There were a lot in Connecticut who, if you were involved in the cloth mills, depended on Southern cotton, and obviously the slave economy that fueled Southern cotton. And even during the colonial period, some people say, oh, it wasn't so bad, but Northern masters were just as hard as their Southern masters in terms of beating and abusing their slaves. Let's not sugarcoat it and try to pretend that It wasn't anything worse than it was. It was worse than, people sometimes make it out. I'm sorry. And the neat thing about Venture Smith is he actually wrote his autobiography where he talks about his life. And this was published in 1798 in New London. And there's a facsimile in this book. I'm going to put the details in the notes to this video. It's available at the library. The other nice thing is his biography is not only included in here, but it's also available as an electronic copy. I'll put that in the links too. And we also have a CD version of it as well at the library, so you can listen to it being read. It's not long, it's about an hour long to listen to. So there you go. I'm going to throw up a whole bunch of stuff in the notes for you to check out. I had no idea there was so much research done on the history of slavery in Connecticut. Some of it goes back to the 19th century, some 20th century, and there's a lot that's been done within the last 7 to 10 years. I'm amazed and I'm really, really happy. So I think it's important in this time to share these stories and make this history known because it's important. If you don't tell it, it just festers and things happen. So there you go. I'm going to weave in the pictures of the graves to end it. And if you want, you can go to Center Cemetery. They actually have a podcast tour. I'm going to put that in the notes too. I got lots of stuff for you this week. And you can walk around the cemetery and stop by Venture Smith's Pomp Equalities and Pitt Judith's graves and mull this all over. So thanks so much for watching. As always, practice safe social distancing. Keep washing those hands, and we'll see you next time. Bye.